Hello, this is Lynn McCool, and I want to discuss with you today the Edifice metaphor and the five canons of rhetoric. There's a fundamental relationship between rhetoric and architecture. Building one's case is analogous to building a fine structure. It is the relationship of discourse as heard and structure as seen. Quintilian wrote, quote, "We are like those who build with a wall of unhewn stone. We cannot hew or polish our words to make them fit more compactly, and we must take them as they are and choose suitable positions for them." End quote. The rhetor, like the builder, must give expression to form. What are the resources by which we accomplish this task? Well, we use words. We fashion a fine structure by combining good reasons with passion to pique the imagination, which stirs the emotions and which moves the will. The end of persuasion is action, and in order to move the audience to action, one must paint vivid images with words. Facts also give arguments weight, and images give impact. Vivacity is a key concept in classical rhetoric. The lively idea is what is striking to the audience. The opposite of a lively idea, of course, is a dead one. So vivid imagery is key to giving one's argument rhetorical potency. If one's argument is potent enough, and the audience will supply a little imagination through the use of metaphor, one can be transported. And as Leland M. Griffin has said and made clear, metaphor has the power to transport. So Griffin developed a theory called the Edifice metaphor, and he applied it to rhetorical theory. In it, Griffin asks us to consider, have you ever been in a beautiful cathedral or in an elaborate ornate building that draws your gaze heavenward? Here's a photograph of the interior of the Chartres Cathedral in France. It's known for its Gothic arches and its rose stained glass windows. The space is always quiet because it inspires a sort of reverence by its very architecture. Now, Griffin comments that what was true of the small and precious stones of the church was true of each massive block and buttress, every arch and vault and spire, of every unseen thrust and counterthrust of rib and pier that divided and subdivided each center of weight and stress. All members worked, and in their working led to beauty, a vast icon with which, in its own anagogical manner, could transport the beholder from earth to heaven. So, you're not just building a basic structure when you construct a speech. This is the comparison in the analogy. You're actually attempting to build a thing of beauty, a fine edifice that has the potential to move the hearers, to transport them. And hopefully this vision inspires you to go beyond simply giving just a speech for a grade. So in order to have the tools that we need to build a beautiful edifice, a beautiful speech, we have to look at something called the five canons of rhetoric. And those are invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. In invention, we ask, what can I say? Invention has to do with the legwork of coming up with good ideas. Invention entails doing research. And this is to ask, what is there to say on the topic generally, and narrowing the topic or deciding one's angle. Out of everything that one could say, what do I want to say about this particular topic at this time with respect to this particular audience? So why would this process be called invention? Because when one is engaged in persuasive speaking or writing, one must invent or construct arguments. Invention is a very involved part of the art of rhetoric. It entails much more than merely deciding one's topic, but these thoughts will suffice for the purposes of this overview. Let's just stop for a moment and talk about how to narrow your topic. People always have trouble narrowing their topics. They always want to say more than they possibly can cover in the time allotted. It's typical. So how does one narrow a topic anyway? Well, a long time ago, I had a student who was a river guide in the Oregon during the summer. He wanted to give information about being a river rat, but he quickly realized that there was so much to it that if he didn't narrow his speech, he'd say a whole lot about nothing at all. So he started narrowing. He first thought about discussing the river, and then he thought about the boats they used to float on the river, and then he hit on a winner: equipment. Again, he realized immediately that there was so much equipment involved that he could never do that topic justice in 4 to 5 minutes. Then he had a stroke of genius. Every river rat has a knife that fits into his sleeve of his or her vest, and the river rat's knife is a very specialized piece of equipment. So, he again realized that this was going to be the focal point of his speech. And out of all the things that he could talk about, he talked about this one piece of equipment. It was an interesting speech, and I've remembered it and used it as an illustration ever since. So, when you want to think about narrowing your topic, think about that one thing that can bring the speech to life. We've all had fear about having a boring topic, but think about this. He spoke about a knife. How potentially boring is that? Yet I've never forgotten the speech. The second canon is something called disposition, and this is asking what arrangement will make the most sense. Here you want to make an assertion or a claim, support it with evidence, reasoning, and an illustration if necessary. Then you will make a transition and move on to your next point. You want to develop your elaborating points without overwhelming the audience with too many details, and you can use something called Plato's clever butcher analogy, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But one thing's for certain, when you're building a beautiful edifice and you go to the store to buy materials, you don't just wheel your cart down the aisle and grab materials willy-nilly. You buy the tools and materials you need according to the blueprint. Well, disposition is all about establishing a blueprint which guides the making process. Okay, so let's look at this clever butcher analogy that Plato talked about in classical Greece. So Plato says in the Phaedrus that a clumsy butcher hacks to pieces a chicken and makes a mess of the whole thing, while the clever butcher recognizes that a chicken has natural divisions, joints, and divides it cleanly at those points. What's the application to speech making? Well, find the natural divisions of the topic, practice and revise it until it seems right. In other words, be brilliant. The third canon is style. And style asks the question, where is emphasis needed? Remember our edifice metaphor? Well, style is key to introducing that element of beauty in speech making. The canon of style may be divided into two parts, ornamentation and orchestration. Ornamentation obviously has to do with the imagery painting word pictures, and that is done through something called tropes and schemes. Tropes are ornamentation that has to do with imagery, sometimes also known as diction, and schemes are orchestration that have to do with rhythm, also sometimes known as syntax. Style is also connected to the artistic proof of pathos, which is an appeal to emotion. So, with the use of style then, we can create beautiful speeches that inspire, that appeal to the mind, the imagination, and the heart. Most people don't envision a shanty when they think of their dream home. When it comes to speeches and papers, aesthetics are as equally important. And this is so for a couple of reasons. First, in order to move an audience, one ought to evoke as vivid a mental image as possible. And this is where pathos and style come together. Secondly, beautiful speeches inspire. Learning to use language artfully to appeal not only to the mind, but also to the imagination and the heart is a very humanizing activity for both the speaker and the audience. Let's just take a minute and look at the scientist Albert Einstein's view on style. He said that imagination is more important than knowledge. And this bespeaks the importance of style and rhetoric. You can muster all the logic at your disposal, but if you fail to move your audience, you will never persuade them. You may convince them, but not persuade them. And the end of persuasion is action, and in order to move people to action, you've got to move the soul. There are quite profound implications here if one stops to consider the ancient principle of internal movement. All right, now let's take a look at Francis Bacon, a philosopher and a writer from the 1600s. Bacon said that style was the application of reason to the imagination for better moving of the will. Human excellence is, in keeping with Einstein's sentiment, a more more of a matter of creativity than of logic alone, and cultivating one's imagination and reason must be done simultaneously. Bacon defines rhetoric in a manner that is congruent with the intellectual climate of his day. What was called then faculty psychology was a project that captivated many thinkers in the Renaissance, and faculty psychology is clearly implicit in the above definition. The soul was understood in terms of its constituent parts or faculties: memory, imagination, reason, will, appetite, and so forth. I think Bacon's definition makes a good introduction to the canon of style because it gets one thinking about the relation of style to pathos. Attending to aesthetics in one's argumentation is important, if for no other reason than it exercises the imagination, both the speakers and the audiences. It reminds us that rhetoric attempts to appeal to humans in the fullness of their being. In the traditional liberal arts education, style was learned by studying figures of speech. Okay, let's go on to the fourth canon, which is memory. And in this one we ask, how can I remember the points in order to make the speech flow? What's interesting, though, is that memory is really not about memorization. Back in the day, when people had to deliver large amounts of text from memory, they invested some time in constructing means of remembering main points. They used mnemonic devices. So memory, combined with delivery, makes use of two other elements, something called kairos and to prepon. Kairos has to do with timing. You know what it's like when you tell a joke and you mess up the punchline. You've messed up the timing. And to prepon has to do with decorum, or the appropriateness of the speech for the occasion. In other words, do the words in the speech fit the occasion? So, for example, you don't give a eulogy at a graduation. The fifth canon is the canon of delivery. Now, memory and delivery are rather obvious and were for some time considered the lost canons of rhetoric. There's not a whole lot to them, at least not on the surface. At any rate, those are the 5 classical canons. In order to master an art, one needs to define it, break it into its parts, study the parts, and then practice it until it becomes second nature. With the canon of delivery, you may subdivide that into 2 parts, physical and vocal. The physical aspects of delivery are things like posture, eye contact, your nonverbals, and gesturing. And the vocal aspects have to do with tone, rate, pitch, and volume. Delivery is also sometimes called performance or performativity. And we know that from just this brief overview of the 5 canons, that your journey of speech making will entail following and studying all the different ways that you can use invention, disposition, style, memory, and delivery in order to craft a beautiful speech. So take a look around the course and continue looking at the course material, and I will talk to you again soon.